Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful afternoon. I don't know why I always start off by talking about the weather. I guess I'm becoming an old guy, but we're having some wonderful weather here in Indianapolis today. It's going to be in the 60s or 70s, and I'm sure that the rain and the cold will be back tomorrow. Well, I hope so far your day's been going pretty good. I enjoy this time on Thursdays when we can get together here on Tears to Wells. That's the name of the podcast that I host. If you're new to the podcast, let me welcome you and say thank you for joining us today. I try to go live every Thursday around noonish. Today I got a little bit of a late start and wanted to go on at 12:15. But if this is your first time joining us, thank you for taking some time to be with us. These videos are recorded live and then posted for folks to go back and listen to. Now, the purpose of this podcast is many faceted, but years ago I came under the influence of a truth in Scripture about turning our tears to wells, found in Psalm 84 and verse 6, where the Lord talked about who passing through the valley of Baca, the valley of tears, make it a well. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is all of us, no matter where you're at in life, are going to go through a hurt, some type of trauma, some type of loss. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this podcast is help you to find significance in that loss or that trauma and then turn around and use it. Now, there'll be some folks who their trauma is so significant and the amount of work that they have to do to bounce back from that trauma or loss literally will launch them into a career of helping others. We call those counselors and therapists and even preachers and teachers. And so maybe that's not you. Maybe the Lord hasn't called you to a lifetime of helping others based upon the help that you've got. But all of us will potentially be able to use our hurts and our hangups and difficulties to help other people. And that's the purpose of this podcast. We want to take our tears, those issues, those situations in our life that have caused us pain and grief and tears, and we want to turn those into wells. So I want to talk to you today about something that's very important that in the realm of trauma and loss, and that's 7 things that our trauma and loss can give us. You know, oftentimes trauma and loss, we feel like we've been robbed, and we have. Many times if we suffer trauma as a child through abuse, abandonment, and neglect, oftentimes at some period, maybe later in life, we will actually grieve the loss of our childhood. We'll think of the many things that we were robbed of. We were robbed of our innocence. We were robbed of our childhood. We were robbed of laughter and joy and different things. And so many times when we associate trauma and loss, we associate being robbed. But you know, the fact of the matter is sometimes in our greatest losses, we have the potential to gain some great gifts. And I use Scripture as much as I can in the podcast, but I want to just briefly look at Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, and it kind of gives us a little bit of a context into what our tribulations do. And in verse 3, it says, "And not only so, but we glory in tribulations." And this was obviously the Apostle Paul writing this. He said, "We glory in tribulations." I'm not there yet, and probably you aren't either, but knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. One of the things the Apostle Paul is saying in this text is he's saying, I can glory and even rejoice in tribulation because I know the tribulation, the difficulty, the loss, the trauma, all of this is not the end point. He says there are some things that are going to be brought on by this trauma that quite frankly are gifts, and he lays them out there. But I want to just talk to you briefly today to kind of give you some perspective on some of I wouldn't necessarily call them blessings because I know some of us are not ready to hear that kind of language, that there's actually blessing in our hurt, there's actually blessing in our difficulty. So I want to just call them gifts of trauma and loss. What are 7 things that are potentially given to us when we go through a period of grief, we go through trauma or loss in our life? The first one is this, and I've got 7 of them, and I think I'll go through these pretty quick. But the first one is one of the first gifts that we get as a result of our trauma and loss is endurance and resilience. Endurance and resilience. You know, trauma and loss survivors have the potential to be or have no quit. I'll tell you, I have met some of the toughest people I've met in my life. Some of the people that there's just absolutely no quit in them. I found that as I started probing a little bit and started talking to them a little bit about their past, about their situation, I found that oftentimes, those people with the greatest amount of tenacity and grit and no quit were those who had experienced either a great loss in their life or a great trauma in their life or several of both. I found that those people that in life that have that tenacity, that just that no quit spirit, are people who have experienced great loss or great trauma. So I just want to just communicate just at one point to you today that maybe you're struggling today and you can't figure out why God has allowed you to go through so many problems in your life, so many traumatic events, so many, I often tease people, when I talk about my life, I said, man, my life is sadder than a country song. The only thing that hasn't happened is I haven't lost my dog yet. And that's a joke. I know it's a dumb joke, but in many cases, some of you are the same way. You're like, why has so much bad stuff happened to me? My childhood, my adolescence, and then I lost this person that I really loved was taken from me. I know those are all difficult situations and very difficult to absorb, but God says in all of that loss, there's a potential to develop endurance or resilience. And that is a great gift. It's a great gift to yourself, but really it's a great gift to others. There's a lot of husbands and wives that bring to a marriage this attitude of no quit. That's a great attitude to have in marriage. I'm not going to quit on this thing. I'm going to keep working at it and keep trying. And if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to try to make this work, or I'm not going to give up on parenting. I'm not going to give up on ministering. And a lot of times those seeds of no quit come from the trauma and loss in our backgrounds. Some of the people that I know with the greatest the greatest bounce back are survivors of abuse. I'm thinking of a young lady. I won't mention her name to embarrass her, but I've known this young lady since she was about 8 or 9 years old, and she has done some incredible things with her life. If I could take you to the little 6-unit apartment where she grew up in, just poverty of all kinds, addiction, all kinds. But there was something that little girl developed along the path of hardship, and that was this endurance and resilience. And she's no longer a little girl, she's a middle-aged woman, but there is absolutely no quit in her, and I admire her so much. So today, just first of all, the gift of no quit is brought to everything we do. When you have this gift of no quit, it's brought to our work, our employment. And some of you today have actually been given promotions and been given responsibility at work simply because you bring that no quit attitude with you. It's brought to our relationships. It's brought to people. Some of you just don't give up on people. And man, there's some people that are out there that are hurting and need those kind of people to work in their life. And it's amazing. Well, where did you get that no quit? You got that no quit from your trauma and your abuse. There's some people checking in, and I think Sammy's checking in and Addie's checking in. Thank you so much for checking in today. But there's a second gift that I want to talk about. The first gift that we get when we or potentially can get when we experience trauma and grief and loss in our life is endurance. But the second gift that we get is a capacity for love. And I'm going to put this word in there too, humor, love and humor. I mentioned this before in the podcast, but there are pastors, or there's one pastor in particular that I've heard him say this, and I love when he says this. He says, I only hire hurt and broken people to be on my pastoral staff. And here's what he says. He says, hurt people love deeply. And that's so true. And there'll be other times on the podcast where we'll have to kind of help people who've been hurt and experienced loss, how to fine tune their love and make sure it's not a toxic kind of love. But I know this for sure. People who've experienced great hurt, great loss, great trauma are incredibly deep at loving people. And isn't that a gift? Isn't that a gift? It's so easy to look at our life and look at the trauma and loss in our life and be focused on it and be upset about that. The things that were taken away from us. But today, I guess I want us to kind of look and focus on some of the things that have been given to us as a result of that loss and trauma. I'm talking to people who will hear this podcast. You are an incredibly deep lover. You love your children deeply. You love your spouse deeply. You love God deeply. And many times, though, that deep love is a gift that comes from being a survivor of grief and loss and trauma. Often it's the most broken who bring the most love to this broken world. I have found, I worked at a Bible college for almost 20 years, and one of the things that the college emphasized was ministry, and what a wonderful, wonderful emphasis. And I was always amazed at the college students, how they would work all week at school, take anywhere from 14 to 20 hours of school during the week, and then minister all weekend long. And I would watch those young people at church. Many of them would pour into the lives of inner city kids and just really just give themselves. And I often found that the kids that stood out, the kids that loved deepest, it would seem that as I got to know them a little bit, some of them had the deepest hurts of their own. And what they had done now is just had worked through their own issues, and now have become great reservoirs of love and so forth. You've heard the story also of Tears of a Clown, how so many times those that are the funniest among us, the clowns of life, so to speak, are those who have shed the most tears. But aren't they the ones sometimes that bring the most humor to us? I think of some of the funniest people I know. My mom was one of them. My mom, she was one of the absolute funniest people I met. Now, my mom was no saint. I know everybody thinks she was, but she was. But we'll talk about mom issues later on. I'm joking, but mom was absolutely hilarious, and it was a gift. My mom could come into a room and it was a little bit tense, a little bit cold, and my mom can warm that room up with her humor, and that humor was a gift that was brought through the trauma and the loss and the grief in her life. Maybe that's you today. Maybe you don't even realize where you got that sense of humor, where you got that laughter from. And many times it was just from our brokenness. Trauma and loss has the potential to give us the gift of love and humor. And isn't love and humor really what brings a lot of happiness and joy to this world? This world is so cold right now, and it needs people to bring love and humor. And oftentimes it's people who've suffered great loss and great trauma. There's a third thing that your trauma and your loss have given you. I said, first of all, it's given us great endurance. It's given us love and humor. But there's a third one that your loss and your trauma has given you, that if you take time and just think about this for a minute, you'll really appreciate it. And that's resourcefulness. Resourcefulness. Maybe an unavailable parent caused you to become resourceful. I know as I look back on my journey, and I look back and I've got to work through issues of my own. But my mom was dealing with abandonment. My biological father left our family. She was pregnant when my biological father left and was dealing with one newborn and one on the way. Depression, major depression, and so forth. So to be quite frank, in those early years of my life, my mom was just not available. And through that, and through a parent that was not available, I had to become resourceful. I had a younger brother to kind of look out for and in many ways take care of myself. And so that trauma or that loss actually forced me to become resourceful. And can I tell you, in this world, resourcefulness is an incredible gift. People pay big bucks to CEOs and supervisors and managers that are resourceful. Sometimes people who are resourceful get ahead in life. And that's why I want you to with me today, kind of take the focus off of all the bad that comes with our trauma and loss and look at some of the gifts that we potentially have. Maybe to escape an abuser, you had to become creative and resourceful. You had to think of creative ways to avoid being in the same room with an abuser. Maybe you had to think of creative ways to stay away from certain people that hurt you. And that creativity and that resourcefulness forced you to grow up. In many cases, we grew up a little too fast, and our childhoods in many cases were taken away from us. But in exchange, there was given to us this gift of resourcefulness. Has anybody ever told you, how in the world do you think of those solutions? Has anybody ever complimented you about how quick you are with your mind? A lot of times that is the gift of trauma and loss. A lot of times we become resourceful. And many times trauma, loss, and grief go hand in hand with poverty. It's just the way it is. The more I research I do on this, the more I realize that poverty goes hand in hand with a lot of these situations. And doesn't poverty make us resourceful? We have to know where to go to get the best deal. We have to know where to go to find the right clothes at the right price. We have to figure out the cheapest way to get from point A to point B. And so many times our hurt, our trauma, and our loss force us to be resourceful, and that is a great gift. Well, there's a fourth gift that comes with trauma and loss. And this fourth gift kind of goes along the heels of what I was just talking about. And that is as a result of our trauma, loss, and grief, sometimes we're forced to learn the value of money. And I mentioned to you that it's interesting how often trauma and loss go hand in hand with poverty. And a lot of times, people who grew up in traumatic homes, people who suffer abuse, people who are in abusive relationships, I would say a majority of the time, right in line with that comes poverty, and it's in the mix. But one of the gifts that poverty brings is it really teaches us the value of money. Growing up without often teaches us to value money and possessions, and that is a great gift. When my wife was alive, we would often have these conversations, and she says, "You're the only one that I know that can stretch $1 from here to next week." And I would laugh, and I would say, "Yeah, I could do that." And that's a gift. That's a gift of childhood, the way we grew up. Some of the people that I know who are the most prosperous today have been people that were given the gift of knowing the value of money because of trauma and loss. I know people today who are actually millionaires because they learned from an early age the value of money, and it came as a result of trauma and loss. So not all the time is trauma and loss accompanied with bad things. Sometimes there are good things that are given to us. I'm going to go through these real quick, but the fifth gift that's given to us, the fifth gift that is given to us by trauma and loss, or potential gift, is perspective of life and wisdom. Perspective of life and wisdom. There are very few things that give us wisdom in life like trauma and loss. Trauma and loss survivors have a unique perspective of life. I don't know if it's because they were forced to grow up. I don't know if they were because they were forced to literally analyze every person that came in the room as safe or harmful, and so they picked up a sixth sense about people. We're going to talk about that later, about how that works against us sometimes, and we're no longer children. We're no longer in danger, so to speak, and we don't need to interpret the world by everybody being safe or harmful. And we're going to talk about that in our podcast. But growing up, that was a safety mechanism for many of us. Many of us were abused by so many people. We literally had to process people's character in split seconds. And you know what? We gain great perspective from that. We actually get wisdom on that. Wisdom about people, wisdom about situations, wisdom to see how things are going to play out. That's an incredible gift that is given to us by trauma and loss. Many of us were forced to grow up really fast. And by growing up fast, we had to be wise about decisions that we made. We knew there was not going to be anybody there to clean up our mess. So therefore we had to be very careful about the messes we made in life. And so that teaches us wisdom. Many of you owned your first car by the time you were 14 or 15 because you just had to make it in life. And so you gain different perspective of life. And then you see life differently because of what you've been through. And I'll tell you, so many people in life need that. There are people that are going through hurt. Maybe you're a survivor now. You've gone through that and you're way past that. But there's other people right now that are in the depths of despair, the depths of trouble, the depths of hurt, and they need somebody to come alongside them and guide them with wisdom. And that's a gift that God has given you through your trauma and through your loss. I want to talk about two final ones because wisdom is important. And I think some of you are selling yourself short on the amount of wisdom you have. That's why I think it's so important that if you're a trauma or loss survivor, I think that's why it's so important that you reach back and grab somebody and pull them up and help guide them through life because you have so much wisdom. I think of some of you that are out there that need to be mentoring elementary school kids and middle school kids and high school kids with your life experience. And God has brought you through too much not to give back. And there's kids right now that are in that same abusive home that you were, in that same traumatic situation that you were, that you can bring a lot of calm to their life through your wisdom. And I encourage you to give back. I encourage you to make your tears a well. And so, that's enough about wisdom and perspective of life. But there's a sixth gift that's given to us through our trauma and through our loss, and that's the gift of empathy. The gift of empathy. Now, empathy is this. Empathy is feeling what other people feel. I know exactly how you feel. Matter of fact, God kind of gives us a little insight to this in the book of Hebrews, where it talks about Jesus was tempted or felt everything. He was at all points tempted as we are, tried, tested, afflicted, yet without sin. In other words, there is nothing that you can say to Jesus that Jesus would look you in the eye and say, I have no idea how you feel. Jesus suffered separation. He suffered loss. He suffered hurt. There is nothing that you can tell Jesus. Isn't that a wonderful encouragement? A little sidetrack there, but there's nothing that you can tell Jesus that he would look you in the eye and say, I don't know what you're talking about. Because Jesus feels what you feel. And that's called empathy. And I tell you, there's a broken world out there. There are literally thousands and hundreds of thousands of people walking around that could be healed from their trauma or their loss if they had just one person in their life to say, I think I know a little bit of what you're talking about. And the tear in your face or the anguish on your face would be a reminder or would be evidence to them that you feel what they feel. And we need people of empathy today. And really the people who have the most potential for empathy are survivors of trauma, loss, and grief. You know, empathy is a gift because so many in this world cannot feel what others are going through. People just walk right by hurting people and absolutely have no feeling at all. And our world is surrounded by broken and hurt people that would love for just one person in their life to say, I don't know exactly what you're going through because I've maybe necessarily never been exactly through that, but I think I feel what you're going through. I can feel it. So many people are healed just by knowing there's somebody else feeling what you feel. And that's one of the great things, just being a little transparent. That's one of the great things that I miss about my wife, miss about having that partner there. There were some things that my wife went through in her life that I went through the exact same thing. And when my wife would talk about it as really therapy between partners, as she would talk about it, the tears would come to my eye or the look on my face would tell her, I know exactly what you're going through. I feel you. And that brought great healing to my wife, and vice versa. There was things that I went through that my wife went through the exact same thing. And as I would talk to her and tell her about my situation, I could look on her face by the response that I was talking to somebody that was feeling what I was feeling, that gift of empathy. And that is a great gift. And so many of you have the potential for that gift because you've gone through so much. And embrace that gift and use that gift. And then finally, the last one, the last gift that we've been given as trauma and grief and loss survivors is this gift of compassion. Compassion is different than empathy. Empathy says, I feel what you feel. Now, compassion takes it to a different level. Compassion is doing something about what I'm feeling. And isn't that what we need in the world today? We need some doers. I mean, there's people out there. We drive through neighborhoods and we have empathy. We look around and we say, hey, somebody ought to do something about that. But you know what? Compassion says, I'll be the one to do something about that. Empathy kind of looks at people and families and difficult situations, say, oh, I feel so bad for them. I feel so bad for them. But compassion takes it another level and says, here's $100 to get some groceries. Here's a night out for the family on us. Compassion takes it to another level. You see, some of the greatest doers and helpers are actually recovering hurt people. Oh, some of my friends that are in ministry that are helping others recover from their hurts and hang-ups are some of the people that have been hurt the most in life. I think of a few of my friends who've lost children, literally have lost children. Others have had spouses go through cancer. Others have grown up in the homes of alcoholics or drug addicts. And so many of them have dedicated their life to making life better for others, starting schools, starting ministries, starting not-for-profits, out there in the nitty-gritty, helping people, having compassion. You see, our society is filled with situations that require doers, people filled with compassion. And you have that potential, my friend. If you've been a person that has been deeply hurt, if you've been a person that has suffered loss or suffered grief, you have the potential for great compassion. And I want to probe that button today and encourage you to act on that compassion. So let's, in closing, and isn't that our favorite words when we're kind of winding down? But in closing today on the podcast, we often think that nothing came from our trauma and loss. I'm guilty of it like anybody else. Sometimes in my private moments, if I get too melancholy or too nostalgic looking back, I tend to focus on the negative. I think of all the things that were taken from me. In many cases, my seasons of my life were robbed, by being involved in toxic relationships and toxic experiences. My faith sometimes has been shaken. Definitely parts of my childhood seems like they were taken from me. If I focus on the negative. And if you focus on your trauma and your loss and your grief in a negative way, you can think of all the things that were taken from you. But we can turn our tears to wells because there are potentially some great gifts that come as a result of our trauma and loss. What are those gifts? We covered them today. Endurance. Hey, some of you didn't even realize that when you were going through all those things, you were building muscles. And you are a resilient person. There is no quit on you. Embrace that gift, use that gift, and trace it back to where it started. All the losses that came in your life built that no quit in you. Secondly, you become a great person of love and humor, or have the potential to have deep love and great humor. That came from our losses. Thirdly, we've become resourceful, right? We can figure things out. We know how to get things accomplished, and we know how to find a way. We become resourceful. We know the value of money, and some of us have a little bit of money now because we've learned the value of it. And we know how to make money, and we know how to share money, and we know how to be providers instead of takers. And all that came as a result of learning from our trauma and grief. Some of us have been given great wisdom now. People look to us for advice and counsel. Some of us are even counselors. We're showing people how to move forward. And a lot of that time, the wisdom came from our trauma and our loss and our grief. Some of us are very empathetic people. We're even what the world calls empaths. We feel deeply. We feel what others feel. That's a gift. And then finally, many of us have acquired the gift of compassion. So these are 7 gifts that come. I'm sure there's more. And if you think of one and you want to drop it down in the comments, wonderful. Have at it, and we'll look at that. But for the moment today, let's just look at these 7 gifts that are given to us as a result of our loss and our trauma. Maybe you're here today and you've experienced some loss and trauma in your life recently. You're trying to make sense of it. You're trying to figure out how any good can come from that divorce. That divorce took years. That bad marriage took years from you. That bad relationship took so much away from you. It stole your self-esteem. It did so much damage to you. I know. But give it time. Give it time, and you'll realize that in some cases, it also gave you some gifts. Some of you are still now, even as adult, having your eyes open to the PTSD and the complex PTSD that came as a result of your childhood. I just challenge you today to focus on some of the gifts and use those gifts. As we use those gifts, we begin to be able to turn our tears into wells. Thank you for giving me your time today on the podcast. And if you have any insight, if you have any wisdom, lay it in the comments. And if you like these videos, make sure that you subscribe. Make sure that you put a like there, and even share this video with somebody that maybe is struggling with making sense of their loss and trauma. We'll be here next week at the same time on Thursdays, somewhere between 12:15, talking about how to take our tears and turn them into wells. Today, we learned about 7 great gifts that come as a result of our trauma. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.